I just took a solid steel meat tenderizer to my brand new $1,200 iPhone 15 Pro Max. I didn't stop until the titanium frame was bent like a horseshoe, and the screen was nothing but a pile of black glass dust on my granite kitchen island. I didn't do it because I have money to burn, and I didn't do it because I'm crazy. I did it because my stepson, Toby, was standing right there in the doorway, and I needed him to watch the only device he thought held the evidence of his crime turn into a useless piece of scrap metal. To him, I'm just a broken old man whose brain got rattled too hard in the accident. But to me, that phone was a tactical sacrifice, the only way to make a predator feel like he'd already won. My name is Miller. I'm 47 years old. I spent 20 years as a homicide detective in the city, breathing in the worst parts of human nature until a bad back injury forced me into an early retirement. I thought I'd finally earned a quiet life here in the suburbs with my wife, Elena, and her 21-year-old son, Toby. I'd raised that kid since he was 12. I'd paid his tuition, covered his legal fees when he got caught in a stolen car at 18, and treated him like my own blood. I thought I built a family. I didn't realize I'd spent 9 years feeding a snake that was just waiting for me to get big enough to swallow. Everything changed 2 weeks ago on the I-94. I was doing 70 in the fast lane when my brake pedal went soft as a sponge. I've seen enough twisted metal on the highway to know when a truck is trying to kill you. I threw the wheel, missed a concrete pylon by 3 inches, and ended up in a ditch. The concussion was so bad I couldn't remember my own middle name for 12 hours. The mechanic told me it was a freak failure, a rusted line that just happened to snap. But I'm a detective. I don't believe in freak failures on a truck I personally service every single month. While I was recovering at home, wearing a neck brace and pretending to be dazed and confused, I found something under the passenger seat of my truck. It was Toby's old burner phone. He must have dropped it while he was checking my oil the night before the crash. I bypassed the lock in 10 minutes, old habits die hard, and found a voice note he'd sent to his girlfriend in Miami. "The old man's truck is a coffin on wheels," Toby's voice said on the recording. He sounded excited, like he'd just won the lottery. I notched the lines. 1 hard stop on the highway and he's history. The $2 million insurance policy is ours, baby. Mom said the house goes in my name once the paperwork clears. We'll be on the beach by January. I sat in my darkened study, listening to my own son talk about my death as a payday. I wanted to walk into the living room and put him through the drywall, but I knew better. I knew if I went to the cops now, he'd claim it was a prank. Elena would cry, defend her little boy, and he'd walk free. So I decided to give them a different kind of show. I uploaded that recording to a secure cloud server and started the performance of a lifetime. I've spent the last 3 days faking episodes. I've been staring at blank walls, forgetting the names of my neighbors, and pretending I can't remember my bank passwords. I told Toby I'd lost the phone that had all my insurance details and my digital vault keys. He's been frantic. He's been tearing this house apart looking for that phone because he knows without it, he can't get to the money. That brings us back to the kitchen island. Toby came running in when he heard the first heavy thwack of the meat tenderizer. He was screaming, asking me what the hell I was doing. I just stood there with a vacant 1,000-yard stare, bringing the metal hammer down again and again until the lithium battery started to swell. I looked at him, let a little spit trail down my chin, and told him the phone was making a buzzing sound, that it was trying to talk to the neighbors. I saw the look of pure, predatory relief wash over his face. He thinks the evidence of his crime, the phone he dropped in my truck, was the one I just pulverized. He thinks the detective is officially gone, replaced by a senile man who can't tell a smartphone from a piece of steak. "It's okay, Miller," Toby said, stepping closer, his hand on my shoulder. His touch felt like a snake's crawl. "You're just having a bad day. Let's go sit on the porch. I'll help you find those insurance papers later tonight." I looked at him and gave him a shaky, grateful smile. The smile of a man who's about to dismantle his son's life piece by piece. "Thanks, Toby," I whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I let him lead me out of the kitchen, leaving the crushed titanium and glass on the counter. The first move was mine. Toby thinks he's free. He has no idea he's already standing in the middle of a crime scene, and I'm the one holding the yellow tape. Toby led me to the back porch like I was a house pet that had just made a mess on the rug. He told me I needed the fresh air to clear my head, and I just nodded, letting my gaze drift toward the tree line. I told him the trees looked like they were leaning in to whisper to me. I saw him roll his eyes, a quick flash of disgust he didn't bother to hide anymore. Why would he? In his mind, I was already a ghost, just a breathing bank account waiting to be closed. As soon as he went back inside to clean up the smashed glass in the kitchen, I felt the cold, hard weight of reality settle in my gut. I sat on that porch chair, the neck brace chafing my skin, and realized I was living in a house with two people who were counting down the seconds until my heart stopped. I reached into the hidden pocket of my cargo pants and felt the small, encrypted tablet my old partner, Hatcher, had dropped off for me yesterday. Hatcher was the only one who knew I was awake. We'd spent 15 years in the same squad car, seen the worst of the worst in the city's back alleys. When I called him and told him my brakes had been notched, he didn't ask questions. He just showed up while Elena was at her yoga class and helped me turn my suburban dream home into a high-tech interrogation room. We'd tucked pinhole cameras into the smoke detectors, microphones behind the baseboards, and a high-def lens inside the fake plant in the living room. I spent that afternoon watching the feed on my tablet from the porch. I watched Elena come home. She looked beautiful, 42, athletic, with that soft Chicago accent I used to love. She walked into the kitchen and saw the pile of smashed titanium and glass on the counter. I heard her voice through the hidden mic, sharp and cold, asking Toby what had happened. Toby's response made the hair on my neck stand up. He laughed, a jagged, arrogant sound. He told her the old mule finally snapped and pulverized his phone with a meat hammer. He told her I thought the phone was talking to the neighbors. I watched Elena's face on the screen. She didn't look worried about my mental health. She smiled. She reached out and patted Toby's cheek, telling him it was for the best. She said a man who can't handle a phone certainly can't handle a $2 million estate. "Did you get the insurance passwords?" Elena asked. "Not yet," Toby replied, his voice muffled as he rummaged through a drawer. "But without that phone, he's got no two-factor authentication. I've already contacted the lawyer Sterling. He's coming over tonight to help us with the emergency paperwork. We'll tell him Miller is a danger to himself and needs a legal guardian." "Good," Elena said, her voice dropping to a clinical whisper. "The doctor said the digitalis should be reaching a peak by Friday. His heart won't be able to handle another episode like the one in the truck." I sat on the porch, my hands gripping the armrests until my knuckles turned white. Digitalis. They weren't just waiting for me to decline. They were actively poisoning my morning coffee. Every vitamin Elena had been giving me for the last week was a slow-acting death sentence. I knew I needed to move fast, but I had to be careful. A cornered predator is the most dangerous kind, and I was currently living in the corner. I decided to head back inside, faking a limp that was only half theatrical. I walked into the kitchen just as Toby was sliding a heavy kitchen drawer shut. He looked jumpy, his eyes darting to my hands. I told him I'd lost my favorite fishing lure and thought it might be in the junk drawer. "There's no lures in here, Miller," Toby snapped, stepping in front of the drawer. "Go sit down, you're making me nervous." I gave him a vacant, watery smile and reached past him anyway. I told him I just wanted to see the shiny things. My hand landed on the handle of the bottom drawer, the one where I kept my old tactical gear and some mementos from the force. I pulled it open before Toby could stop me. Right on top was a pair of heavy, stainless steel Smith & Wesson handcuffs, my old service pair. The ones I'd used to haul 100 killers to the precinct. Toby's face went the color of curdled milk. He looked at the cuffs, then up at me, his hand drifting toward the heavy glass vase on the counter. For a split second, the air in that kitchen was electric. I could see the calculation in his eyes, wondering if he should just finish me right then and there with a blunt object. I felt my old detective instincts flare. My hand instinctively twitched toward where my holster used to be, but I caught myself. I let my jaw go slack. I picked up the handcuffs and started jingling them like they were a set of baby keys. "Look, Toby," I whispered, my voice high and thin. "Shiny bracelets. Do you think Sarah would like these for Christmas? I want to give her something special." Toby let out a long, shaky breath. The tension left his shoulders, replaced by that familiar, condescending pity. He reached out and snatched the handcuffs from my hand, throwing them back into the drawer and slamming it shut. He told me those weren't for Christmas. He told me those were bad memories, and that I needed to forget I ever saw them. "You're really losing it, aren't you?" Toby muttered, more to himself than to me. "The lights are on, but nobody's home." "I like the lights," I said, staring at the ceiling. "They're bright." He shoved me toward the living room, telling me to stay in my chair until dinner. I went, sitting in the dark, watching the shadows grow long across the floor. The close call had been too tight. Toby was getting twitchy, which meant the timeline was accelerating. I pulled out my burner phone under the cover of a throw blanket and sent a text to Hatcher. "They're using digitalis. Lawyer named Sterling is coming tonight. Need the stage 3 files on Sterling now." I sat there in the silence of my own home, listening to Elena and Toby clink glasses in the next room, celebrating a victory they hadn't won yet. I realized then that being a detective was easy when the suspects were behind an interrogation table. It was a whole different game when they were the ones tucking you into bed. But I was still a miller, and a miller doesn't just catch the killer, he builds the cage. I heard a car pull into the gravel driveway. The headlights swept across the living room wall like a searchlight. "He's here," Toby whispered from the hallway. The lawyer was early, and I had a feeling the emergency paperwork he was bringing wasn't just for guardianship. It was for my total liquidation. I closed my eyes and let the fog settle back over my face. The hunt was moving into the final phase, and I was exactly where I needed to be. The front door opened, and a blast of cold Chicago air followed a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of cheap suet. Sterling wasn't the kind of lawyer you found in a high-rise downtown. He was a bottom feeder, the kind who did his best work in the back of dimly lit bars and handled private, estate matters for people who didn't want a paper trail. He was wearing a trench coat that had seen better decades and carrying a briefcase that smelled like stale cigarettes and desperation. I sat in my recliner, staring at a blank spot on the wall, letting a little drool pool at the corner of my mouth. I heard Toby and Elena greeting him in the hallway, their voices hushed and urgent. They brought him into the living room, and Sterling stood over me, snapping his fingers in front of my eyes. I didn't blink. I just hummed a tuneless song and told him the shadows were getting longer. Sterling let out a dry, rattling laugh. He told Elena that I was prime for the picking. He opened his briefcase on my coffee table and pulled out a stack of documents. He told them that the irrevocable power of attorney and the asset liquidation authorization were ready for my mark. He said that once I signed, Toby would have the legal right to sell the house, empty the retirement accounts, and manage my medical care indefinitely. "Is he lucid enough to sign?" Elena asked, her voice tight with a feverish kind of greed. "In this state, a judge would toss it if he had a good lawyer," Sterling replied. "But we aren't going to a judge. We're filing this with my notary in the morning. By the time anyone asks questions, the money will be moved through the offshore accounts Hatcher. I mean, the accounts we discussed." My heart did a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. Sterling was about to say Hatcher's name, my old partner. For a split second, a cold, paralyzing fear gripped me. Had Hatcher betrayed me? Was my only lifeline actually part of the web? I forced myself to stay limp as Toby grabbed my hand. He shoved a heavy fountain pen into my fingers. It felt like a cold iron bar. He told me it was a get-well card for the neighbors. He told me I just needed to draw a little picture on the bottom line. I let my hand shake, making a messy, jagged scrawl that looked like a bird's nest. It wasn't my signature. It was the danger code I'd used back on the force, a specific series of loops that meant the signer was under duress. Once the papers were tucked back into the briefcase, Sterling suggested they celebrate in the kitchen. They left me in the dark, thinking the old mule was finally broken. As soon as the kitchen door swung shut, I pulled the encrypted tablet from under my blanket. I tapped into the microphones Hatcher had hidden behind the baseboards. I needed to know about that slip of the tongue. I needed to know if I was truly alone. The audio was crystal clear. I heard the clink of ice in glasses. Then Sterling spoke, his voice low and conspiratorial. He told Elena that she was getting better at this. He asked her if Miller was tougher than her first husband in Miami. I froze. My thumb hovered over the screen. Elena had told me Toby's father died in a tragic car accident when Toby was 10. She'd always played the part of the grieving widow who'd found a second chance at love with a stable cop. Miller is a detective, Elena said, her voice dropping to a clinical, deadly tone. He's observant, or he was. Toby's father was easier. A few vitamins in his beer and a faulty space heater was all it took. But Miller, I had to let him settle into retirement first. I had to wait for him to get soft. And the boy, Sterling asked, does Toby know he's helping you kill his second father the same way you killed his first? A long silence followed. I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. Toby thinks it was an accident, Elena replied. He thinks he's the mastermind behind the truck's brake failure. Let him think that. It makes him a better accomplice. Once the insurance clears and the house is sold, Toby is going to have his own accident in Miami. I'm not splitting $2 million with a kid who can't keep his mouth shut. I sat in the dark, my eyes burning with a rage I hadn't felt in 20 years. She hadn't just targeted me. She demurdered Toby's father and was now grooming the boy to be her next victim. She was a professional reaper, a black widow who used her own son as a disposable tool. But then the kitchen door creaked open. I didn't have time to hide the tablet. I barely had time to slide it under my thigh before Toby walked in. He was holding a glass of water, the special water laced with digitalis. He looked at me, his face pale in the moonlight. For a second, I saw a flicker of the 12-year-old boy I'd taught to tie a tie. I saw a shadow of the kid I'd loved. "Here, Miller," Toby whispered. "Drink up. It'll make the voices stop." I looked at the glass. I looked at the boy who was unknowingly signing his own death warrant by helping his mother. I realized then that my long con wasn't just about my survival anymore. It was a salvage operation. I took the glass. I made sure my hand didn't shake. I looked Toby right in the eye, and for a fraction of a second, I let the fog vanish. I let him see the homicide detective who'd sent 100 men to the chair. "You really think she's going to let you go to Miami, Toby?" I whispered, my voice a low, gravelly rasp. Toby froze. His jaw dropped. The glass in his hand started to tremble. He opened his mouth to scream for his mother, but I moved faster than a man my age should be able to. I grabbed his wrist with a grip like a bear trap and pulled him close to my face. "Listen to me and listen fast," I growled. "Your mother killed your father and you're next on her list. Sterling just confirmed it in the kitchen. Hatcher is recording every word. If you yell, you die. If you listen, you might just live to see the sunrise." The close call was over. The dark second layer was exposed. And as the sound of Elena's laughter drifted from the kitchen, I watched the boy I raised realize that he'd been sleeping in a nest of vipers. "What do I do?" Toby whimpered, his eyes filling with a sudden sharp terror. I looked at the kitchen door. I looked at the special water. I told him that it was time to change the recipe. Toby looked at me like I was a ghost that had just climbed out of a shallow grave. His eyes were wide, and I could feel his pulse thundering in his wrist under my grip. He tried to pull away, but I leaned in closer, my face inches from his. I told him that if he didn't stop shaking, his mother would hear the ice in the glass. I told him that for the next 10 minutes he had to be the best actor in the world, or he was going to end up in a body bag in Florida. I let go of his arm. He slumped against the wall, gasping for air. I told him to go back to the kitchen and tell them I drank every drop of the special water. I told him to act like everything was normal. "But she killed my dad," Toby whispered, his voice cracking. "She did," I said, my voice as cold as a morgue slab. "And she's already picked out the spot for you. Now move, before Sterling gets suspicious." I watched him shuffle back toward the kitchen, his shoulders hunched. I sat back in my chair and pulled the tablet out one more time. I needed to see Hatcher. I tapped a specific icon on the screen, a direct link to a camera hidden in a van across the street. The screen flickered, and Hatcher's face appeared. He was wearing his old department headset. He saw me and gave a sharp, single nod. He told me that he'd heard everything Sterling said. He said the Hatcher mention was a bluff. Sterling had been trying to intimidate Elena into paying him more by pretending he had a dirty cop in his pocket. "The sheriff is 2 minutes out, Miller," Hatcher's voice crackled in my earbud. "We've got the Miami files. We've got the digitalis recordings. The net is closed. You ready to pull the trigger?" "Wait," I whispered. "I want the confession on the truck. I want Toby to hear her admit it herself. I want the boy to see exactly who she is." I went back to the fog. I heard the kitchen door open, and the three of them walked back into the living room. Elena was smiling, that bright, beautiful smile that had tricked me into thinking I'd found a second chance. She sat on the edge of the coffee table and took my hand. She told me she was so proud of me for being cooperative. "Toby said you enjoyed your water, honey," she cooed. "You feel better now, ready for a long sleep." I let my head loll back. I muttered that the truck was loud. I asked her why the truck tried to bite me on the highway. I saw Sterling shift uncomfortably. He wanted to leave, but Elena was savoring the moment. She leaned in, her eyes glinting with a feverish kind of pride. "The truck didn't bite you, Miller," she whispered, her voice low and clinical. "Toby notched the lines. He's a good boy. He did exactly what I told him to do, just like his father. He was always so eager to please. It's a shame, really. But you were just too observant for your own good. You should have stayed a regular retiree instead of a detective." Behind her, I saw Toby standing in the doorway. He was recording everything on his phone, just like I'd told him. He heard it all. He heard his mother admit to grooming him into a murderer. He heard her call him a shame. I saw the boy's face transform. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity I'd seen 1,000 times in the interrogation room. Toby stepped forward, holding the phone up like a weapon. "I have it, Mom," Toby said. His voice wasn't shaking anymore, it was steady. "I have the confession about Dad, about the truck, all of it." Elena spun around. Her face went from loving wife to cornered wolf in half a second. She lunged for Toby, screaming for him to give her the phone. Sterling scrambled to get his briefcase, heading for the front door. That's when the physical shock I'd been planning finally hit the room. Sound of the front door being kicked off its hinges with a thunderous boom. The door didn't just open, it flew across the entryway. Hatcher and 4 uniformed officers burst in, weapons drawn. They weren't the polite suburban police. They were a tactical unit from the city. "Police don't move," Hatcher roared. Sterling dropped his briefcase, and papers scattered like white leaves across the floor. He hit the rug and put his hands behind his head before the first officer even reached him. Elena tried to run for the back porch, but I didn't let her. I stood up from my recliner. The broken Miller was gone. I moved with the fluid, practiced grace of a man who'd spent 20 years on the street. I caught her by the arm, twisted it behind her back, and slammed her face first onto the granite kitchen island. The same island where I'd pulverized my phone with the meat tenderizer just hours ago. The shadows aren't getting longer, Elena, I growled into her ear. The lights are coming on, and you're the only one left in the room. I reached into the bottom kitchen drawer, the one Toby had seen earlier, and pulled out my service handcuffs. The shiny bracelets I'd teased him with. I clicked them around Elena's wrists with a rhythmic, satisfying ratchet. Hatcher walked over, looking at the $2 million insurance policy on the floor. He looked at me and grinned. Nice acting, Miller. You almost had me convinced you'd lost your marbles. I looked at Toby. The boy was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands, shaking. He was a criminal, sure. He'd notched my lines. But he was also a victim of a monster I'd shared a bed with for 3 years. What about the kid? Hatcher asked, his hand hovering over his own cuffs. I looked at my stepson. I looked at the boy I'd raised. I realized then that the final part of the cage wasn't for him. It was for the woman screaming on my counter. He's a witness, Hatcher, I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. He's the one who gave us the killing blow. Let the DA handle the rest. As they led Elena and Sterling out in the cold Chicago night, the sirens filling the air, I stood in the middle of my living room. The infestation was finally being cleared out. But as I looked at the smashed titanium on the counter and the forged papers on the floor, I knew I wasn't done. The trial was coming. The Miami case was being reopened, and I had a long, hard road ahead to figure out how to be a father to a boy who tried to kill me. The fire was out, but the ashes were still hot. The trial in downtown Chicago wasn't the circus the media expected. It was a cold, clinical autopsy of a marriage built on a graveyard. I sat in that front row every single day, wearing my service blues, my back straight despite the ache that never really goes away. I wanted Elena to see me. I wanted her to look into the eyes of the old mule who had outmaneuvered her. The evidence was an avalanche. Hatcher and the Miami PD spent 4 months digging up the past, and what they found was chilling. Elena hadn't just killed Toby's father. She'd been linked to a series of unfortunate accidents across 3 states. She was a professional predator, a woman who specialized in finding lonely men with stable pensions and turning their homes into death traps. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Hatcher played the recording Toby had made. The entire courtroom sat in a deafening silence as Elena's own voice echoed through the speakers, admitting to grooming her son and calling him a shame to his face. I watched the jury's faces. Some looked sick, others looked like they wanted to jump over the railing. Sterling, the bottom feeder lawyer, flipped within 48 hours of his arrest. He traded his pride for a 15-year sentence, testifying about the offshore accounts and the digitalis project. He described the way Elena would laugh over drinks while planning my cardiac arrest. When it was Elena's turn to speak, she didn't beg. She didn't cry. She sat there with that same icy poise, blaming the world, blaming the system, and eventually blaming me for being too smart for my own good. The judge, a man who'd seen 30 years of Chicago's worst, didn't hold back. He called her a stain on the sacred bond of motherhood and sentenced her to life without the possibility of parole. Toby's situation was more complicated. He'd notched my break lines. He'd participated in a murder plot. But the psychologists and the DA saw what I saw, a kid who'd been brainwashed and manipulated by a monster since he was in middle school. Because of his cooperation and the evidence that he was his mother's next target, he was given 5 years of intensive probation and a mandatory stay in a long-term rehabilitation facility. The day he was being transported, I went to see him. We stood in a quiet hallway of the courthouse, a pair of deputies watching from the end of the hall. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He just stared at his shoes, the same sneakers I'd bought him for his birthday. I told him I didn't forgive him. Not yet, maybe not ever. But I told him that the Miller in him, the part I'd raised, was still worth saving. I told him that when he got out, if he stayed clean, he'd have a job waiting at Hatcher's security firm. I watched a single tear roll down his face before he nodded and walked toward the van. It was a long road to redemption, but at least he was finally on the right one. I returned to my house a week later. The suburbs were quiet, the lawns perfectly manicured, hiding the rot that had almost swallowed me whole. I didn't sell the place. I stayed. I tore up the granite kitchen island where I'd smashed my phone and replaced it with a heavy butcher block I built myself. I threw away every piece of furniture Elena had touched. I'm 47 years old. I live alone, but for the first time in a decade, I'm not lonely. I spend my mornings on the porch, drinking clean coffee and watching the sun hit the oaks. I've started consulting for the cold case unit downtown, helping them look for the signatures that predators like Elena leave behind. People ask me why I didn't just call the cops the second I found that burner phone. They ask me why I went through the show of faking a mental breakdown and smashing my electronics. I tell them it's simple. When you're dealing with a fire, you don't just throw water on it. You have to understand the fuel. You have to let it burn long enough to see what's truly at the center. I needed to see the heart of the monster, and I needed the world to see it too. I walked out to my backyard grill last night. The charcoal was cold, and the grass had started to grow back where the heat had scorched it. I thought about that iPhone I'd pulverized with the meat tenderizer. It was a $1,200 sacrifice, a small price to pay for the truth. I took a deep breath of the Chicago air, feeling it sharp and clean in my lungs. The detective was back on the job. The cage was locked, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the shadows to get longer. I was the one holding the light.